morning, everybody. Just telling the Curtises, or the Curti, I don't know how you pronounce that. But I was telling the Curtises that I'm pretty sure if I didn't say anything, that class was starting, everybody would just keep talking until 10:20, where we vaguely think that we need to actually start worshiping at that point. Because everyone's just kind of hanging out talking, which is a good thing. That means that the church is warm and friendly. That's always a good thing to see. We're going to be in James 1, though. We've got a few more classes to finish up our discussion of James, and so we're going to look at one verse this morning, one verse next week. If you remember, we've kind of taken James as a summary. James chapter 1 is a summary of the entire book. And so we're going to kind of coordinate James 1 and 26 with James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. I think James 1 operates as a very nice kind of overview of the entire book, and so we're kind of taking a piece and doing it with the whole book at large. And what James chapter 1 and verse 26 discusses is the tongue. And so this is obviously everyone's favorite subject, which means nobody can talk at all because nobody wants to incriminate themselves. But this is another one of those sections that we've talked about that everyone remembers. James 1:26 is probably one of the more well-known verses in the first chapter. James chapter 3, the first 12 verses are always a popular section to kind of throw at people. And so there's going to be a lot of attention this morning, hopefully. But we'll try to keep the pew throwing to an absolute minimum. Before we begin, though, I'm going to ask Scott, if he doesn't mind, to lead us in a word of prayer.
Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father God, thank you for this day, Lord, and what you give us, and thank you for this hour that you've given us to gather here together and worship you, Father. Please be with the teachers of this day, Father, and help them to have a ready recollection of all those things that they've studied, Father. Help them to be able to present their lessons in a way that even the youngest mind might understand, Father. Please be with those of our number that aren't here with us today, and help them to return the next appointed time, Father, to be our will. Please go with us now as we continue through these further exercises of this worship service, Father. Help us to do all those things that are right in our sight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. As I mentioned, we're going to be... I clicked it over in the prayer, now I can't say anything. That's awesome. I should do that for effect during the sermons. I really got to As I mentioned, we're going to be in James chapter 1 and verse 26. We're going to look at verse 27 next week, and that'll obviously round out James chapter 1. These are two very distinct verses. James 1:26 is very well known, 1:27 is very well known. They're really, though, in my opinion, kind of two halves of the same coin. You kind of have fake religion here, verse 26. You have kind of pure religion there, verse 27. So they're kind of two halves of the same coin. We're going to take them kind of a piece at a time, though. We're going to look and focus on verse 26. When you look at verses 19 down through verse 25, though, this obviously leads very well into it. What does he start discussing at the beginning of verse 19? And Colton, if I give the signal, you crank that sucker up real quick and then turn it back down. I need everybody's attention. What does he begin with in James chapter 1 and verse 19? Yeah, quick to hear, slow to speak. I noticed everyone learned their lesson from last time we discussed the verse because everyone was very slow to speak on that one. Yeah, he starts talking here in verse 19. Everyone should be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Why do you think he starts with that? Why do you think he kind of segues into it if you look at verse 19? Why do you think he really emphasizes that section? Quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Right, we're getting ready to talk about self-discipline. That's a good point, isn't it?
That's sort of the starting skill of self-control.
Right.
Just kind of keep your time.
Right.
Not being overly impulsive.
Exactly, which I have a huge issue with. I like to kind of shoot first and ask questions later. I think probably most of us are like that kind of by nature to a certain extent. But you're right, that's obviously the beginning of self-discipline. Solomon would talk about throughout the Proverbs, better is he who can guard his tongue than somebody who is mightier than 100 cities. Obviously paraphrasing like 3 Proverbs at once. But he discusses the power of having self-control. If you don't have self-control, your fortress is wide open, your gate is wide open, Solomon would talk about that. And so he starts talking in verse 19 about being quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger to kind of lead into this last section. It's important to point out that everything he talks about from verse 19 on, and I think most of the book, everything he talks about from 19 on is addressed to the individual. There are people who will look at verse 27, for instance, and talk about pure and undefiled religion, about visiting orphans and widows, and say, well, that's us as a church. The context clearly in James chapter 1 is not talking to a church. Who's he talking to in James chapter 1? Right, he's talking to the individual. Why do you think he focuses so much on the individual instead of the church? Because he could have very easily, talked about all of this in that context. Why do you think he addresses the individual, though? Individuals make up the church, exactly. And if the individual is watching their tongue, what happens to the church? The church, yes. The church collectively watches theirs too, exactly. So when you look at verse 19, for instance, he says everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Verse 20 is kind of this explanation verse on that, where he says the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. And then he goes into verse 21 down through verse 25 and just kind of expounds on that idea. He says, therefore, putting aside all filthiness, all the remains of wickedness, in humility receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. Prove yourselves doers of the word, and not merely hearers who delude themselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror. For once he has looked at himself and gone away, he has immediately forgotten what kind of person he was. But one who looks intently at the perfect law of liberty, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be blessed in what he does. What is James stressing now in James chapter 1? Right, people of action, not just people of lip service. Why do you think he talks about that? What's the problem he's addressing?
Self-deception.
Self-deception, exactly. Why do you say that?
Because it does use the phrase, you're deluding yourself and that sort of thing.
Right. All right.
It's very easy for us to see the faults of others and not aware of our own.
No, it's not. It's not easy for us to be aware of the faults of others and be immune to our own. That's ridiculous. No, I think that's exactly what he talks about. It's very easy for us to look at everyone's faults and say, well, that person needs to do something differently, that person needs to act differently, and then forget what, as Linda mentioned. Right, how we need to act. Exactly. Which I think makes up the core of what he talks about here in verse 26. When you look at verse 26, this is obviously the only verse we'll read in chapter 1, then we'll be moving to chapter 3. But he said, if anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. What would it be very easy for us to think about ourselves? Because we go to worship services every time the doors are open, we read our Bible often, we talk to other people about the gospel. What would it be very easy to think about ourselves? Horribly constructed sentence. Yeah, I'm okay. I'm alright. I'm not really that bad. Yeah. What else would it be tempting to think about ourselves as? Very highly of ourselves, exactly. Because I do all the what?
Receives everything that people see.
Right. I do all the things. Yeah, I do all the external things. And even more so than doing things that everybody sees, what am I really doing? Because I think he uses this word religious very intentionally here in this passage. Not just the things that everybody sees, but all the things that what? All the things that we say. Right, all the things that we say we do, yeah. What else do you think?
You can apply what he's addressing to the Pharisees. These guys, these other Christians, were so familiar with
Right.
where this is the way they conducted themselves. The Pharisees, heard that
Right.
out of their reason.
Right. And you said that was a little bit of a side point, but I think that's actually the main point that he's addressing. Because if you look, and we've kind of done this every class, but if you look back at the audience that he's addressing in James chapter 1, he's not addressing Gentiles. Who's he addressing in James 1? Right, the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad. And so these Jews are familiar with, as Joe mentions, these kind of external shows of religion. And that's why I mentioned earlier, I think that's why he uses this word religious very intentionally. I don't think this is something he just throws in there. I think he says, if you think you're religious and you don't bridle your tongue, then you're not religious in the least. And that's what he talks about there towards the end of that verse. But if you remember in Matthew 23, kind of going off of what Joey talked about, if you remember the first 10 verses, 9-10 verses in Matthew 23, that's really where Jesus presents his kind of cornerstone rebukes of the Jews or the Pharisees. And he says these are people who love the what? Their love, yeah, that's kind of the summary verse. But yeah, these are people who love the praise of men, but they love to do what?
Outward shows.
Right, outward shows of religion, yeah. But what do they love? They love to stand where? Well, kind of, yeah.
On the street corners.
Right, on the street corners, and they love to be praised. When they give alms, what do they like to do?
They like to be seen.
Right, they like to be seen, but if you remember, Jesus says in that passage, he says, listen to what they tell you because they sit in Moses' seat, but don't what?
Do what I should.
Right, don't do as they do, exactly. What does Jesus mean by that? So he can't say, do what they tell you to do, but don't do what they do. That seems counteractive. What does he emphasize?
Act from the heart.
Act from the heart, exactly, which is also to not act from where? Not act with what? Throw a little curveball at you there. Don't do religion for what's sake? Don't do your religion to be seen, exactly. And I think that's why James talks about this, not only because Jesus had brought it up, and obviously James borrows a lot from the teachings of Jesus he probably heard first, second hand, but he says here in this passage, if anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. The main emphasis that he's driving towards, in my opinion, is against this external show of religion, where we do everything to be seen of people. We do all the things that people notice. We're at church, we read our Bible, we pray before meals, but we don't actually do anything to guard our heart, to secure our soul. And I think that's what he's addressing here. What else do you think he's talking about here in verse 26? Because this is a very loaded verse. We won't spend a ton of time on it. But what else does he address here in James 1:26?
About this self-deception.
Right. Right. That's the carryover from the verses immediately before that about the self-deception. Yeah, that's a good point. What else is going on here in James 1:26? Yes?
Really, you can cancel out any good thing you might do.
I'm right there with you. I'm right there with you. Yeah. I'm
I'm
not that far with you, but yeah, I was with you up until that point. Yeah, what do you think he's talking about here in James 1:26? And I think Howard was on to it. You can cancel out everything you do.
Doing it for the wrong reason.
By doing it for the wrong reason, exactly.
Self-deception, or just
Right. You're not really doing it because you want to do it. You're just kind of going through the motions. You're doing it to be seen, which is very easy for us to show up Sundays and Wednesdays. It's very easy to dress nicely when you come to the worship assembly, and everybody else to think this is somebody who has it all together. This is somebody who's right with God. But what he's pointing out here to the individual in verse 26 is if you do all these external shows of religion, and this is kind of the bigger thought, but your heart isn't really right, then your religion is basically worthless. He zeroes in verse 26 to connect religion with one thing in particular. What does he connect it with? Whether or not you can what? Right, whether or not you can control your tongue. Is that a fair comparison by James? That your speech and how you talk and how you act and what you say in your everyday life should determine the value of your religion? Randy says yes. I was actually going to read those verses, but yes, you can go ahead and quote them for us if you want to, my shot. Close. I know. Yeah. I'm just trying to do to you what Russ did to me during the meeting, where you can't come off of a verse off the top of your head. But yeah, Matthew 12, I think that's exactly what he's getting at. Matthew 12, he says in verses 37 through 39, it's not what goes into the heart of a man that defiles him, it's what? What comes out of it? Exactly. Why does he put emphasis on what comes out of your mouth? Well, true, that is what people hear. Yeah.
And if speech can fool you with speech for a little bit, but if you listen to them often, that you
Right.
you can tell how a person is not really wrong.
Exactly. And I think
a little bit get there sometimes, but you can tell a person's heart. It's not what it says.
right. And that's true, and you said it may take a while to get there. I would agree with that too. It takes a while to get right. It takes a while to get to know their character. But I would argue even that, there's those stats that come out that say 7% of communication is actually verbal. The other 93% are body language, tone, that type of stuff. And so I think you could probably tell pretty quick kind of where this guy's going at with stuff. But you're exactly right. If what's coming out of your mouth is lies, if it's gossip, if it's hatred, if it's strife, then those things are obviously going to reveal the character of the person. And so to answer the question, is it fair for him to kind of equate what comes out of your mouth with your religion? I think it's absolutely true, because what comes out of your mouth originates where? From your heart, exactly. And if what's in your heart is bad, then what comes out of your mouth will be also bad. I think that's what he really points out. Yes?
And look at that word bridle. That's like control, isn't it?
It is, right, and that's actually where we're going to be at in James chapter 3 in a second. But you're exactly right. It's a, yeah, if you just want to go sit by Joe, that'd be great. Yeah, it is about control, and that's what we led off the class with talking about. Because if you can't control your own heart, if you can't control, your tongue, then what value is your religion? If you say you're a Christian, but everything else about you says that you're not, then your religion is obviously worthless. And I think that's a little bit of what he touched on too.
You know, I can give you an example. I did some work years ago for this man that was a pretty high up in a rural congregation around the area. And I heard of him, a long time. I went out to his house to do some work. And when I got out there, after I saw the liquor laws, went around doing some stuff, and he was just like Satan. And I thought, this guy's reputation is so good, and here he is like this,
Yeah.
and it can really, it was worthless. It was
Right. Yeah.
It became worthless to me.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And that's the thing that was sometimes easily glossed over, and I think that's where the self-deception comes in too, is because it is very easy for someone who attends, church, or who is high up in a congregation, or whatever that means. I don't really know what that means. But whoever has a good reputation within a congregation, people look at them and say, well, that guy's obviously got it together. But then when you look at his life, you see that one of those doesn't really match the other one, and that the other one's probably an act. And I think that's really what he's talking about here, is don't put so much focus on the external shows of religion that we try to show off to other people. Make sure your heart is worthwhile, because out from your heart will come out all these pure things. Does anyone else have any thoughts? Yes,
I
Paul?
think that's one of the professional interrogators and FBI profilers, those kind of people. I think that's where they are able to make an assessment of a person's character where you and I can, because they can see through the facade and they can tell by the expressions exactly what the character of that person is. You can't hide it.
Right. That's a topic I would love to discuss with you more, because I think the whole interrogation professional, especially people that negotiate with terrorists, I think those people are fascinating in the way that they construct vocabulary. I obviously don't have that skill. But you're right, I think they can perceive things about people that maybe the rest of us can't. Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts or comments on that verse? What's the problem with putting this into action in James chapter 1, verse 26? Because it's very easy for us to say, yeah, your internal show needs to be good as well, or else your external thing will be worthless. What's the problem with implementing this in everyday life?
Impulsiveness.
Impulsiveness is probably it, yeah. That's true.
Particularly if it's in an area that we're especially passionate about.
Right. It's much easier to be quick to anger than it is to be slow to anger, right? Yeah.
It kind of depends on what our conversation is going sometimes.
Right.
Because we all have buttons that we want to push.
That's true, and Joe knows all of mine, pushes them every Sunday and Wednesday. Nathan's not here, so I have to kind of go after you. But you're right, I think that is a little bit, impulsiveness is a problem. Zoom out a little bit. What's the problem with putting this into practice?
Other than peer pressure,
Well, you don't see where it would be, and that's easy, and I'm not picking on you now, but it's one of those things that's easy to say here in the church. Like, well, of course, we should always guard our own heart, guard our tongue. What's the problem with their everyday practice?
Right.
I'm sorry?
Pride. It always comes down to pride.
That's true, yeah.
We always want to one up the other guy.
Right.
Our speech, because that's the one we can.
Yeah, and sometimes we want to just kind of, our ego comes into it. We want to, somebody says this or somebody comes at us, we want to one-up them. I think that's a good point too. Right, exactly, which means what about it? Right, if you lose focus, that's a problem. But since it's a 24-hour job, 24/7 job, what does that mean? Is that it's really what? It's hard, exactly, which is what James talks about in chapter 3. Look at James chapter 3. It's very easy for us to sit and hear and talk about James 1:26 and guarding your heart, guarding your tongue, because that's how your religion's going to be valid. But when you get to James chapter 3, this is where he really explodes it. And that's where he discusses just the difficulty in doing something like this. I want to read all 12 verses, and then we'll kind of talk about it piece by piece a little bit. Look at James chapter 3, starting in verse 1. He says, "Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone doesn't stumble in what he says, he's a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. And if we put bits into the horses' mouths so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. Look at the ships also. Though they're so great, driven by so strong winds, they're still directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body, and sets on fire the course of our life, and is set on fire by hell. For every species of beasts and birds, of reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race, but no one can tame the tongue, for saints. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord our Father, with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing, my brethren. These things ought not to be this way. Does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. James makes a very sharp kind of break at the end of chapter 2. He goes into chapter 3 and starts talking about something completely different. Even though I do think the two are related. How you act and what your faith looks like is dependent on what your tongue is like. I think that's the connection between chapters 2 and 3. But what's James's opinion about James chapter 3? Or about the tongue in James chapter 3? What's his opinion about the tongue? It's a fire. Like the fire you said that with. Yes. It is a fire. What else is his opinion about the tongue? Because he does not mince words. James is not known for that. The very world of iniquity. No man can tame the tongue. Which goes against what we talked about here in James chapter 1 verse 26. When he says, if anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet doesn't bridle his tongue, this man's religion is worthless. James chapter 3 and verse 8, he says, no one can tame the tongue. How do you reconcile those two? Because there are people who look at that and say, well, why should I even try? How do you reconcile those two?
There's a difference between taming it and bridling it.
Okay, maybe.
You should always try to control it, but it's never a job that's going to be totally, completely done.
Right. And I think that's really what I was thinking too. It's never something that you can sit back and you can say, I have mastered the tongue. I will never say another evil word. I will never say gossip ever again. I'll never cuss again because I have got it on lockdown. And I do think that's the main idea that he goes towards here. Who does he start talking about in James chapter 3 verse 1? Teachers, exactly. This is the best picture I can find of a teacher. I think a more accurate one would have been like a tornado or something like that. But why do you think he addresses teachers? Right. The responsibility they have, exactly. Does that mean everybody else can just kind of ignore the next 11 verses, or what does that mean? Right. Exactly. There are two ways to look at this. As Kim would say, there's two schools of thought. There are two ways to look at this. There are people who look at this and say, well, if he's talking to teachers in this instance, then what he's trying to focus on is to emphasize the point that these are people that really need to pay attention to what's happening. There are other people who would say what Paul says, which is all of us are teachers, and everyone kind of needs to look at it that way. Which one of those is true?
The general term teacher or specific term of instructor. So they can both be true depending on your crowd.
Right. That was a trick question that wasn't that tricky. They're all true to a certain extent. Both of them are true. Teachers need to be paying special attention to this because why? Right, their influence. What you say to somebody and how you guide people. What's the best illustration that you can think of that in Scripture? Jesus. I was actually thinking of a negative one, but you're right. Jesus is a good illustration of that. What's a negative example of that?
Pharisees.
The Pharisees are a great one. I hadn't thought about that, but that's a good one too. What else can you think of? Peter, exactly. When you look at Galatians chapter 2, Peter had led so many people away that not only had they gone astray, but who else had gone astray? Even Barnabas exactly had been carried away by hypocrisy. Did you have something else, Paul? Okay. Yeah, I think that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the importance of teachers. It's not only towards teachers, but it's especially towards people who are guarded with the idea of instructing other people. Look in Proverbs chapter 10. Keep your finger in James 3. Look back to Proverbs chapter 10. I like what Solomon has to say here. Proverbs chapter 10, starting in verse 19. He says, says, when there are many words, transgression is unavoidable, but he who restrains his lips is wise. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 20. The tongue of the righteous is as choice silver, the heart of the wicked is worth little. The lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for lack of understanding. What does Solomon preach in those 3 verses? It is better to be quick to hear than slow to speak. I'm going to say it's better to be thoughtful than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. I've heard that phrase used a lot when we talk about James 3. Not by you, no. What else is he teaching, though, in James 3? Or, I'm sorry, in Proverbs 10. It's good to be slow to hear, or I'm sorry, quick to hear and slow to speak. What else is he teaching there? Right, thinking before you speak, using wisdom before you open your mouth. Right. What's the core principle in verse 19 that he addresses? Because I think this absolutely applies to teachers. Restraint, yes, that's true too. Restraint is a big part of that. What's Sharon?
It says the lips of the righteous feed many, so we should be using our tongue to feed.
We should, right. And that has more to do with the end of James chapter 3, verse around 10, 11, 12. But you're right. When you look at Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 9, Proverbs chapter 10, let me jump back to it. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 19, he says, when there are many words, transgression is unavoidable, but he who restrains his lips is wise. And I think that's where the restraint comment came in. But that very first line that he says, what's the core principle? When there's more words, there's more what?
Well, you need to choose your words wisely.
Right.
What you say can have a lot of impact, so choose the right words.
Right. You need to choose your words carefully. I think Jeff hit on it a second ago.
Because if you've been in a situation, you just start talking, you might fool of yourself, but you might say something.
Right. And I think that's the main thing. Not only will you make a fool of yourself, which I never experienced, but you also, and I think that's the main thing that you were talking about, which is you may say something you can't take back. And that's, I think, what Solomon is really talking about. Yes?
Many times, even good friends get into arguments and say a lot of things that they wouldn't understand.
Right. And the worst part about that is they never make up for it. They never talk about it, they never address it, and then a little thing that's said maybe in anger, said in passing, becomes a 20-year issue. Yeah, I think that's a big problem. He also mentions in verse 20 and 21 the value of it. And Solomon would spend a lot of time throughout the Proverbs discussing the value of wisdom, the value of knowledge. What does he value in verse 20 and 21? The tongue of the righteous. The person who is able to discern what they say before they actually say it. Think about what they say before they actually speak. And that's a lot of what James is addressing. In James chapter 3, when he says this in verse 1, let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will occur in stricter judgment. He then says in verse 2, for we all stumble in many ways. Why do you think he goes from verse 1 to verse 2? He talks about verse 1 about the nature of stricter judgment for teachers. And then he says in verse 2 this kind of big nebulous statement, we all stumble in many ways. What's the connection there?
You're human and you're going to mess up.
Right.
But you have to keep in mind, what the goal is.
Right. We're all human. We're all going to mess up. You have to keep in mind what the goal is going to be. Yeah, Howard?
We don't stumble on purpose.
Exactly. None of us stumble on purpose. And that's the connection between the two. That's exactly what I was wanting to say. We all stumble in many ways. Nobody's perfect. But stumbling on purpose is totally different than stumbling on accident. And so I think the admonition to teachers is you need to pay special attention to what you say because very few people set out to become false teachers. How many of the false teachers that you can identify, we could probably go through 1,000 of them right now, how many of them set out with the intention of deceiving the entire world? Do you know of anybody? You probably think of a few that are on TV. But how many people set out and say, I'm going to deceive the entire world? Where does that false teaching come from? It comes from half-baked theology, for one, where people just kind of read two verses and think they know what God's talking about. But where does false teaching come from? No, exactly. It all either goes back to pride or Satan. That's usually one of the two answers. Right? It comes back from somebody thinking they know better, thinking they can outsmart somebody else, thinking they can outwit them. And so when he talks to teachers here, verses 1 and 2, everybody stumbles in a lot of ways. But this is an area you need to pay attention to, especially if you are charged with being a teacher, because there are souls at stake instead of just your own soul. I think that's another connection that makes between the two. He then addresses, starting in verse 3, three different things. He has three kind of comparisons. What's the first comparison? Horses, exactly. He says we all put bits into the bridles of horses' mouth. Why does he bring up horses?
It's a big, powerful animal.
Right. It's a big, powerful animal that you're controlling by what?
Something small.
By something small, exactly. What's the second one that he brings up? A ship, exactly. Why does he bring up a ship? There's an arrow there to help you.
It's the same thing, the rudder. It's a small thing.
Right. You've got this massive vessel, this massive boat that is guided by what?
Little tiny rudder.
Right, this little tiny rudder, or in some ways, a big rudder, but still tiny in comparison to the overall ship. Yeah. What's the third thing that he brings up? Forest fire, exactly. Why does he bring up a forest fire? And if we were in California, this would be a really good object lesson. Right, a tiny little spark ended up in a huge fire. I remember the commercial when I was a kid. It was a barbecue commercial where somebody was charcoaling and a little flame of the charcoal went up into the atmosphere and landed on their neighbor's house, and it didn't burn up their house because the charcoal was somehow safer or something like that. But anyways, that always kind of imprinted in my mind how such a huge flame can be started from such a tiny little thing. What's the point that he's driving at with all three of these? Because he doesn't just bring up a horse and a boat and a forest fire for no reason. What's the point that he makes there?
The danger involved.
Right, the danger involved, but not just the danger, but what else?
Just the lasting effect.
Right, I think the lasting effects are a big thing. You start, especially in the course of the ship, you change it just a little bit. Initially, it's not a big deal. Over time, it becomes a huge split.
You know, it's a small thing that does all this.
Right.
It's a small thing that steers your horse.
Exactly. And it's a small thing that steers the horse, a small thing that steers the boat. And because it's small, what usually happens to it in our eyes?
You assume nothing's going to happen.
Right. Well, right. You assume nothing's going to happen, or do what? You ignore it completely. You overlook it. When you're doing your final, I'm not a boat captain by any stretch of the imagination. You're from West Texas where there was no water. But if you have a boat and you're doing an inspection, you look at a whole bunch of things. But how many people go off and check the rudder 100 times and just make sure that it's okay? I would imagine, unless we've got other boat captains, and I'm going to say this authoritatively because I don't think we do, I would imagine that's not the main thing. You check the engine, you check the sails, you check all the compartments, you check all these different things, but you don't really check the rudder because it's small. You assume that it's going to work, but you only notice it doesn't work when what? When you're off in the middle of the ocean and all of a sudden you find yourself off the Indian coast where you should be in North America. So there's a whole bunch of applications that you can make with this. And that's really what he's getting at, is such a little thing can cause such a big issue. And that goes into the next section. That's where he amps up the rhetoric there at the end of verse 5. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And then he issues just a litany of kind of, not accusations, but a litany of descriptions. How does he describe the damage of the tongue? It defiles the entire body. What else does he say? Right. It sets on fire the course of our lives. And what else does it say right after that? Set on fire by hell. That is a remarkably strong set of language from James. Why does he use such strong language here? And what is the specific meaning of set on fire by hell? Why does he use such strong language here?
The principle is that this untamed tongue is not something that God has appointed. And so he's focusing on the fact that it's all comes from something.
Right. The untamed tongue is not something God has a part in. It's a tool that Satan can use. That's to me the definition of set on fire by hell. Satan can use something that's small, something insignificant, something we overlook, to destroy the entire body. And really when you look at not only what was up there on the PowerPoint, but when you look at what he said right before that, it's something that defiles the entire body. It sets on fire the course of our life, and it's set on fire by hell. So Satan can use the tongue to do what? To destroy us, and to destroy what else? To destroy our souls, exactly. Now, do we see this play out in everyday life? I really expected 400 hands to shoot up and everybody start talking about personal stories. Where do we see this play out in our life? Or something that's small, something that is overlooked, something insignificant like the tongue, destroys souls, destroys churches. Where do we see that? Yeah, CNN. I knew someone would have to give the counterweight to that. Yeah. Fox News, CNN, just kind of this really strong, inflammatory type of statements. Yeah. How else do we see this? All of us have seen this play out in our lives. Where do we see this at?
Arguments that we have with our spouse.
Brent, would you like to respond? Hey, happy Father's Day, by the way. Yeah, arguments with our spouse. All of a sudden, something little or something that you left the mayonnaise out overnight. How could you? And then all of a sudden, two people are living in different houses.
You see it everywhere. I mean,
You see it everywhere.
relationships with family,
Right.
relationship with coworkers,
Right.
peers at work. It's amazing how work, the smallest thing, can turn into this big thing and spend 2 days arguing over it.
Yeah. Not in my work, but I can imagine in your work.
You see it everywhere.
Right.
You see it, people dealing with everything.
Right. That's what I was getting at. And when you don't see it, you obviously see it in marital situations. You see it in churches, you see it in individual lives. But the point is, you see it everywhere. All of us can think of at least 100 different examples where two, otherwise well-meaning people or a relationship that would otherwise been great ends up being sour. And then when you break down the conversations, when you weed through all the mess that it results in it, what do you find out? That usually what this big flame started from what? Such a little small fire, exactly. And that's why he focuses on this. It's not like he just is trying to shock people. If I wanted to do that, I'd have Colton crank the thing back up again. But he's not just trying to shock people. He's trying to get people to see the impact of something that we oftentimes overlook. And you see this immediately after that. Verse 7, for even species of beasts, of birds, of reptiles, of creatures of the sea, all these things are tamed and have been tamed by the human race. But no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. That restless evil and full of deadly poison, to me, defines and clarifies James chapter 3 and verse 8 with chapter 1 and verse 26. When he calls it a restless evil and full of deadly poison, what does that create in your mind? What is that imagery? I'm sorry? A viper, yes. Snakes, which is no wonder why Satan, the Garden of Eden, was a snake. What else does it create in your mind? That imagery. What does that tell you about it, brother? It'll lead to death, exactly. But think about how poison operates. Poison doesn't, just...
It's slow.
Right. It's a slow-moving, slow-acting. Now, obviously, some viruses obviously can have more faster-acting, but by and large, poison is not something that kills you in seconds, unless it's just really hyperactive. But it's something that slowly takes apart your body. When he talks about it as a restless evil, why does he use that phrase?
Because there's never a point where it's just stagnant, it's just
Right.
continually
Right.
there.
It's always present. It's always going to be there. And that's what David was talking about earlier, that it's never something that we can just say, I've got it mastered. You can master everything on this earth. You can master any beast, but Satan knows that the most bang for his buck per capita comes from where? Where can he have the most impact? On your tongue, exactly. That's the thing that destroys churches. That's the thing that destroys relationships. That's the best way that he can impact souls. Somebody have any thoughts or comments real quick before we move into this
I
last section?
still want to get back to what Paul said earlier, it was pride.
Right,
You got the 3 categories of sin.
right,
This one, this fits into the pride.
right.
So, what it perceived in practice, or humility.
Right, yeah, that's a good point. The implanted word received in humility, yeah. I do think pride not only plays a part in creating the problem, I think pride also has a part in not solving the problem either. All of us, go ahead.
Perpetuates.
Right, yeah, that's true too. All of us have said things we wish we could take back. Problem is we don't apologize, or even worse, we say more things that make it just even worse. Yeah? Look at also what he says right after this, in verse 9. And this is, I think, another kind of side point that he makes to the overall issue about the danger of the tongue. But he says, with it, talking about the tongue, we bless our Lord and the Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. That's a strong phrase too, because what is he saying in that? We curse men who have been made in the image of God. And this goes a little bit with what we talked about on Wednesday when we discussed abortion.
Some man is it, they did critical, but he's not following the image of God as he is. Very hypocritical.
Maybe. I think you put a comma in a different place than I would. But yeah, I think that's a good point too. We're supposed to be made in the image of God, which is, never lying, never speaking evil. I think that's a valid point. What's his point, though, ultimately, though, when he says this in verse 9? We curse men who have been made in the likeness of God.
We devalue what the human is.
Right.
We have to remember that it was treated that much of creation of God, which goes back to the abortion. And we just devalue.
Right. A human being has been made in the image of God. And so by defaming these other humans, what are we doing? We're speaking evil against them. What are we ultimately doing?
Yes, God.
Right. We're defaming God himself. Exactly. Which goes back to the overall point from James 1:26, which says if somebody can't guard their tongue, what value is their religion? Worthless, exactly. In other words, you can have all the external shows of religion you want in here and out there sometimes what people see, but if you're cursing other people and if you're defaming other people, then ultimately your religion is worthless because you're tearing down the image of God. Paul makes the exact same argument in Romans 14 when he discusses the eating of meats. He says, I'm not going to destroy with food that which my Christ died to save. That's a very powerful point that Paul also makes from that section as well. When he says here in verse 9, though these have been made in the image of God, from the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. What does he say these things ought not to be? Or what should not be this way?
Hypocrisy of using their tongue to praise God and turn around and teach
Right. The hypocrisy of using the same mouth to both bless people and curse people at the same time. Bless God, curse God. It's this duality that God doesn't want. The true Christian will always seek to build up rather than destroy. Even in terms of criticism, even in terms of disfellowshipping, the true Christian will always seek to build up instead of trying to tear them down. I think that's part of what he talks about. These last few verses, 11 and 12, just kind of go over the same idea. A fountain does not send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water. Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Salt water cannot produce fresh. What's his point in verses 11 and 12? We'll end a couple minutes early, I think, this morning. You can't have it both ways, but he doesn't just describe it as you shouldn't have it both ways.
It's not natural. Well, in nature, it's not natural.
Right, it's not natural. You can't have it both ways, but it's an impossibility. A Christian cannot be doing this type of stuff because it's not who they are. And that's what I really want to get towards. There's 3 points, I think, just to kind of finish this one. There's 3 points you can make about the tongue to kind of summarize everything we've talked about. Number 1, it's small but can move big things. And if there's nothing else that we've discussed throughout the course of this morning, that's what I really want to get across. Is the thing that we sometimes overlook is the thing that can sometimes make the biggest impact. And so even though it's small, it can move huge things. Number 2, it brings forth both good and bad. We have with our tongues the ability to bless people, the ability to curse people. We should be using it to bless people. That's his point there. And number 3, it reveals ultimately what's in our heart. All 3 of these points you can see from what he describes in James chapter 3, verse 12 and 12. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments? By the way, this goes into very well when he talks about verses 13 through 18, which we discussed earlier in the quarter, about you demonstrate your wisdom by your actions, by your deeds. You demonstrate what's in your heart by how you live. Okay, if there's nothing else, we'll pick up with 127 next week, and then we will do a wrap the week after that.